Story. A soldier found an injured German shepherd in chains. His next move was incredible. The humid air hung heavy, thick enough to choke on, in the heart of a jungle teeming with unseen life, yet eerily silent save for the insistent drumming of rain on emerald canopy. Sergeant James Carter, a man etched with the grim landscapes of war, moved with a weary precision, his boots sinking into the sucking mud with each deliberate step. This wasn't a sanctioned mission. This was a pilgrimage of sorts, a journey into the darkest recesses of his own soul. His face, a roadmap of past trauma, held the haunted emptiness of a man adrift, a man drowning in a sea of guilt and regret. 3 years. 3 years had passed since the ambush, since the day the jungle itself had roared with hellfire, taking with it Corporal Mike Rodriguez, his best friend, and Axel, their K9 companion, a German shepherd, as much a brother-in-arms as any human. The official reports declared Axel KIA, a casualty of the brutal encounter. James had carried that grief like a lead weight, the image of the explosion, the sound of Axel's cut-short yelp, forever seared into his memory. Therapy, medication, empty platitudes, nothing had eased the gnawing pain, the relentless nightmares. He'd lied to his family, telling them he was on deployment. The truth was far more desolate. He planned to vanish, to lose himself in the impenetrable green, leaving behind a world saturated with the ghosts of yesterday. He was a ghost himself, a walking echo of the man he once was. Then, a sound pierced the oppressive silence, a sound so fragile, so filled with raw suffering, that it momentarily jolted James out of his despairing trance. A whimper, faint, almost swallowed by the rain, but unmistakably a cry of pain. Something primal stirred within him, a flicker of the empathy he thought long extinguished. His training kicked in, honed by years of combat, and he moved cautiously towards the source, his senses on high alert. The clearing was small, a pocket of desolation amidst the vibrant life, and there, chained to a massive ancient tree, lay a creature that made James's breath catch in his throat. A German shepherd. Gaunt, its ribs a stark ladder beneath matted fur, its eyes dulled with exhaustion and an unbearable, heart-breaking fear. The chains were new, heavy, deliberately placed to ensure its captivity. This wasn't a stray that had wandered into trouble. This was an act of deliberate cruelty, a slow, agonizing sentence of death. James, a man hardened by war, felt a wave of nausea churn within him. He'd witnessed the horrors of human conflict, the brutality men inflicted on each other, but this was different. This was pure, unadulterated malice directed at a helpless animal. He approached slowly, his voice a soft murmur, a stark contrast to the gruff commands he usually barked on the battlefield. "Hey, buddy," he whispered, his hand outstretched, palm up, a gesture of peace. "I'm not going to hurt you, I promise." The dog flinched, its ears pressed flat against its head, its teeth bared in a weak, defensive snarl. But there was something in its eyes, a flicker of recognition, a haunting familiarity that sent a tremor through James's core. He saw scars, old and new, crisscrossing the dog's body, evidence of systematic abuse that made his blood boil. Who could do this? His gaze dropped, focusing on something half buried in the mud near the dog's collar. He brushed away the grime, his fingers trembling. Metal, a dog tag, caked with dirt and rust, almost illegible. With painstaking care, he wiped it clean and the world tilted on its axis. Axel, Military K9 Unit 214. The breath caught in James's throat. He stumbled backward, his vision blurring. It couldn't be. Axel was dead. He'd seen him die, witnessed the explosion, felt the searing heat. But the tag, the unmistakable name.
"Axel?" he croaked, his voice thick with disbelief and a burgeoning hope. "Oh God, Axel, what did they do to you?"
The dog's ears twitched at the name, but the vacant fear remained. No spark of recognition, no joyful bark, only a dull resignation. James reached out again, slowly, cautiously. Axel recoiled, pressing himself against the tree. The rain poured down, washing the grime from his face, mixing with the tears he could no longer suppress. This wasn't just any dog, this was his partner, his brother, the one who had saved his life countless times. And someone despicable, had kept him alive all these years, torturing him, breaking him down until he was a shadow of his former self. He rummaged in his pack, pulling out his water bottle. He poured some into his cupped hand, offering it to Axel. The dog hesitated, distrust warring with desperate thirst. Finally, his tongue darted out, lapping at the water with increasing urgency. As James watched Axel drink, his carefully laid plans, his desire to disappear, shattered like fragile glass. He'd believed he had nothing left to live for, but fate, in its cruel yet strangely compassionate way, had led him here. Someone had done this to Axel, someone connected to that terrible day 3 years ago, and they were still out there. The wind picked up, carrying with it the distant sound of breaking branches. James's head snapped up, his senses on high alert. For a fleeting moment, he thought he saw movement, a shadow flitting behind a tree. They weren't alone in this jungle. Axel, despite his weakened state, suddenly tensed, a low growl rumbling in his chest. He wasn't looking at James, he was looking past him, into the deepening darkness. Despite the fear, despite the exhaustion, there was something else in his eyes now, a warning. James felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. He wasn't just rescuing a dog, he was stepping into something far more dangerous, a tangled web of secrets and lies that reached far beyond the confines of this jungle. This was just the beginning of a mystery that would challenge everything he thought he knew about that tragic day. Thunder crashed overhead as James worked feverishly to free Axel from the chains. The padlock was old, crusted with rust, but stubbornly sturdy. He pulled out his multi-tool, his hands surprisingly steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. Each click of the metal made Axel flinch, a testament to the abuse he had suffered. "Almost there, buddy," James murmured, his voice barely audible above the storm. "Just hold on." As he worked, his mind raced. Axel had been declared KIA. There had been a ceremony, a memorial plaque, a folded flag presented to the K9 unit. How had he ended up here, alive but broken? And more importantly, who had kept him all this time inflicting such unspeakable cruelty? The lock finally gave way with a soft click. James carefully unwound the chains, revealing more scars, more wounds beneath. The burn marks were the most disturbing. Perfect circles that could only have been made by cigarettes.
"You're safe now," James whispered, his throat tight with rage. "I won't let anyone hurt you again."
A flash of lightning illuminated the clearing, and James saw something metallic glinting in the undergrowth about 20 feet away. His instinct screamed danger, but curiosity, a desperate need for answers, won out. "Stay here, Axel," he said softly. But to his surprise, the dog struggled to his feet, defying the pain, defying the exhaustion. He took a shaky step forward, then another, following James. The metallic object turned out to be a surveillance camera, mounted low in a tree, partially hidden by leaves. Its lens was cracked, but a small red light indicated it was still operational. James's blood ran cold. Someone had been watching Axel's suffering, monitoring him like a lab rat in some sick experiment. He reached up to grab the camera, but Axel suddenly barked, a hoarse, urgent sound. James spun around just as a dark figure darted between the trees. Without thinking, he started to give chase, but Axel's teeth caught his sleeve, pulling him back with surprising strength. The dog's eyes were no longer vacant. There was intelligence there, and fear, not for himself, but for James. A warning.
"You know them, don't you?" James asked quietly. "You know who did this?"
Axel released his sleeve and limped a few steps towards a dense patch of vegetation. He pawed at the ground, whining softly. James followed, pushing aside the leaves to reveal a small hollow beneath a fallen log. Inside was a weathered backpack, military issue, partially decomposed from exposure. With trembling hands, James pulled it out. The name tape was still legible. CPL Michael Rodriguez. Mike's pack. How? Inside, he found a waterproof tactical notebook. Most of the pages were blank, but in the middle, there was a hastily scrawled message. Jay, if you find this, trust no one. The ambush wasn't random. They wanted the intel. Axel knows where. Keep him safe. M. James sat back on his heels, his mind reeling. The official report had stated that their unit had stumbled into an enemy position by accident. But Mike's message suggested something far darker, a planned attack, a targeted strike. But what intel? And who were they? A branch snapped nearby, and both James and Axel tensed. The rain had softened to a drizzle, making it easier to hear movement in the jungle. Someone was circling their position. James quickly stuffed the notebook into his pocket and shouldered his pack. They needed to move, but when he looked at Axel, his heart sank. The dog was trembling with exhaustion, barely able to stand. They wouldn't get far with him in this condition. Making a quick decision, James shrugged off his jacket and spread it on the ground. "Come here, buddy," he whispered, patting the fabric. To his surprise, Axel understood immediately. He carefully lay down on the jacket. James gathered the corners, creating a makeshift sling. "I know it's not comfortable," he said as he lifted Axel, grunting with the effort, "but we need to get out of here." As if understanding the urgency, Axel remained perfectly still in the sling, his eyes scanning the darkness around them. James began moving through the jungle as quietly as he could, grateful for his military training. Every few steps he paused to listen, trying to detect pursuit. They had gone about half a mile when Axel suddenly grew tense in the sling. His ears pricked forward and a low growl rumbled in his chest. James froze, straining his senses. At first, he heard nothing but the drip of water from leaves, then a click, the unmistakable sound of a safety being switched off. James slowly turned around. In the growing darkness, he could make out 3 figures emerging from the shadows, their weapons trained on him. They wore civilian clothes but moved with military precision. "Sergeant Carter," one of them called out softly, "put the dog down and step away. This doesn't have to get messy." James's mind raced. They knew his name. They had been waiting for him. None of this was a coincidence.
"Who are you?" he demanded, though he suspected they wouldn't answer.
"The dog, Sergeant, now." Axel's growl grew louder, and James felt him struggling to get free of the sling. Despite his weakness, despite years of abuse, the old warrior spirit was awakening in him. He wanted to fight. "Last chance," the man said. "Don't throw your life away for a dying dog." James looked down at Axel, at the scars that marked years of torture, at the eyes that now blazed with recognition and purpose. In that moment, he made his choice. "He's not just a dog," James said quietly. "He's my partner." Then, several things happened at once. Axel burst from the sling with unexpected strength. James dived for cover behind a massive tree trunk, and the jungle erupted in gunfire. Bullets splintered bark inches from James's head as he pressed himself against the tree. Through the chaos, he heard Axel snarling, followed by a man's scream of pain. Despite his weakness, the German Shepherd had apparently lost none of his combat training. "Take the dog alive!" someone shouted. "We need him." Those words sent a chill down James's spine. This wasn't about silencing witnesses or tying up loose ends. They wanted Axel for something specific. Mike's message flashed through his mind. Axel knows where. A bullet grazed his shoulder, burning like a hot wire. James bit back a cry of pain and assessed his situation. He had no weapon. He hadn't planned on needing one for what he'd intended to be his final journey. But he did have his military training and intimate knowledge of jungle warfare. "Axel, come," he called out, using the old command tone that had served them so well in combat. To his amazement, Axel immediately disengaged from his attack and limped rapidly towards James's position, staying low. The bond was still there, buried beneath years of abuse and trauma. Axel remembered his training, remembered what they had been together. James reached into his pack and pulled out his emergency flare. The rain had stopped, and the jungle floor was covered in dry leaves. It was risky, but they were out of options. "Stay close, buddy," he whispered to Axel, who pressed against his leg, breathing heavily, but alert. Then, James struck the flare and threw it into a dense patch of vegetation. The effect was immediate. Dry leaves and branches caught fire, creating a wall of flames that spread quickly in the darkness. Shouts of alarm rose from their attackers as the fire forced them to retreat or risk being trapped. Now, James scooped up Axel, ignoring the burning pain in his shoulder, and ran in the opposite direction. The dog was heavy, but adrenaline gave him strength. Behind them, the fire created confusion and cover for their escape. They ran for what felt like hours, though it was probably only minutes. James's lungs burned and his wounded shoulder screamed in protest, but he didn't stop until they reached a small stream. He set Axel down gently and collapsed beside him, chest heaving. "Good boy," he gasped, reaching out to scratch behind Axel's ears. This time, the dog didn't flinch away. Instead, he pressed his head into James's hand, his tail wagging weakly. The simple gesture of trust brought tears to James's eyes. After everything Axel had endured, the loyal heart of his old friend was still there, still willing to trust and fight beside him. But they weren't safe yet. James tore a strip from his shirt and quickly bandaged his shoulder. The wound wasn't deep, but it needed attention. More pressing was Axel's condition. The burst of activity had taken its toll on his weakened body. The dog lay panting, his legs trembling with exhaustion. "We need to find help," James muttered, more to himself than to Axel. But where? The nearest town was miles away, and those men would be looking for them. They needed somewhere closer, somewhere safe to rest and regroup. That's when James remembered the old ranger station. It had been abandoned years ago when the Park Service built a new facility, but the building should still be standing. "Think you can make it a little further, buddy?" he asked Axel, who struggled to his feet in response, determination in his eyes. They moved more slowly now, James supporting some of Axel's weight as they picked their way through the darkness. The moon had risen, providing just enough light to navigate. Every sound made them freeze. A nightbird's call, a rustling in the canopy above, the snap of a twig. After about an hour, the ranger station came into view. It was a small wooden structure, weathered but intact. James approached cautiously, Axel limping beside him. The dog's ears were forward, alert for danger, but he showed no signs of anxiety. The door was locked, but the wood around the handle was rotted. One solid kick, and they were inside. The interior smelled of dust and abandonment. Moonlight filtering through dirty windows revealed a simple room with a desk, some chairs, and a basic first aid cabinet mounted on the wall. James helped Axel settle onto an old blanket he found in a corner, then checked the first aid supplies. Most were expired, but he found some still sealed bandages and antibiotic ointment. He cleaned and dressed his shoulder wound, then turned his attention to Axel's injuries. The dog lay still as James carefully cleaned the worst of his wounds, only whimpering slightly when antiseptic was applied to the deeper cuts. As he worked, James talked softly, telling Axel about the 3 years he thought him dead, about the guilt and grief that had nearly destroyed him. "I should have looked for you," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I should have known you were too tough to die in that blast. Mike knew, didn't he? That's why he left that message." At the mention of Mike's name, Axel's head lifted, his eyes fixed on James with an intensity that sent shivers down his spine. There was intelligence in that gaze and something more, a desperate need to communicate. "What is it, boy? What were you guarding out there? What do you know?" Axel struggled to his feet and limped to the desk. He pawed at the bottom drawer, whining softly. James opened it, finding only dust and old papers. But Axel's excitement grew. He nosed aside the papers, revealing something scratched into the wood of the drawer bottom. Numbers, coordinates.
Coordinates, James breathed, recognizing the format. But to where?
Before he could copy them down, Axel suddenly went rigid, a low growl rumbling in his chest as his eyes fixed on the window. James dropped to the floor, pulling Axel with him into the shadows. Flashlight beams swept across the windows. "They've been found," a voice commanded outside. "Check inside. They have to be here somewhere." James looked at Axel, saw the same determination in his partner's eyes that he felt in his own heart. Whatever secret Axel had been protecting all these years, whatever truth Mike had died trying to expose, it was worth fighting for, worth dying for, and they would face it together. James's mind raced. The ranger station had only 2 exits, the front door and a small window in the back. The window was their best chance, but Axel was in no condition for another chase through the jungle. The door handle rattled. James pulled Mike's notebook from his pocket and quickly copied down the coordinates Axel had revealed. Whatever they led to, he couldn't let it fall into their pursuers' hands.
"On 3, a voice commanded outside. 1, 2.
James wrapped his arms around Axel, lifting him as gently as possible. The dog remained perfectly still, understanding the need for silence. They had just reached the back window when the front door burst open with a crash. Flashlight beams swept the room as 3 men entered, their boots heavy on the wooden floor. James held his breath, pressing himself and Axel into the deepest shadows behind an old filing cabinet. "Clear the corners," one man ordered. "They're here somewhere. The dog's bleeding. There's a trail." James looked down, and his heart sank. Small droplets of blood from Axel's wound marked their path across the floor. The trail led directly to their hiding spot. Axel tensed in his arms, a low growl building in his chest. James stroked his head silently, willing him to stay quiet. But he knew it was only a matter of seconds before they were discovered. That's when something unexpected happened. A series of loud crashes echoed from the jungle, followed by shouts and gunfire. Their pursuers spun towards the sound, momentarily distracted. "What the hell was that?" one of them demanded. "Team 2's under attack," a voice crackled through their radios. "Multiple hostiles, professional operators, we need backup." The men exchanged glances, clearly torn between continuing their search and responding to the call for help. Another burst of gunfire decided it for them. "Check the perimeter and fall back to the rally point," the leader ordered. "Move!" They rushed out, leaving the door open behind them. For several long moments, James didn't move, hardly daring to breathe. Who was attacking their pursuers, another player in this deadly game? When the sound of footsteps had faded, James carefully set Axel down and crept to the door. The jungle was quiet again, but in the distance he could see flashes of light and hear the faint pop of gunfire. "This is our chance, buddy," he whispered to Axel, "but we need to move fast." Instead of heading directly away from the fighting, James chose to circle around it. The sounds of combat would mask their movement, and their pursuers would be focused on the new threat. They made slow progress through the darkness. Axel was getting weaker, his breathing labored. The burst of activity earlier had depleted his already limited strength. James's own shoulder throbbed, and he could feel blood seeping through the makeshift bandage. After about 20 minutes, they came across fresh tire tracks in the mud. A vehicle had passed through recently. Following the tracks led them to a narrow dirt road, barely visible in the moonlight. "We need to find transport," James muttered. "We'll never make it on foot." As if in answer to his thoughts, a faint engine sound reached his ears. Headlights appeared in the distance, coming their way. James quickly pulled Axel into the undergrowth, watching as a battered pickup truck approached. The truck was moving slowly, its driver clearly struggling with the muddy conditions. As it drew closer, James made out a Parks Department logo on the door. A ranger, probably checking on reports of gunfire in the area. It was a risk, but they were out of options. James stepped onto the road, waving his arms. The truck slowed to a stop, and a young ranger peered out through the window, looking nervous. "Thank God," James called out, trying to sound relieved rather than desperate. "My dog's hurt. We need help." The ranger's eyes widened as he took in James's bloody shoulder and Axel's condition. "What happened? I heard shooting." "Poachers," James lied smoothly. We surprised them while hiking. They opened fire. "Please, my dog needs a vet." The ranger reached for his radio, but James quickly added, "The poachers took my phone. Could you just give us a ride to town? The authorities can take our statement thereafter." After a moment's hesitation, the ranger nodded. "Hop in the back. There's a blanket back there for your dog." James helped Axel into the truck bed, then climbed in himself. As they drove away, he watched the jungle recede behind them, still echoing with distant gunfire. Who were these new players, friends or enemies? The coordinates from the ranger station burned in his pocket. He pulled out the notebook and studied them again. They pointed to a location deep in the mountains, at least a day's journey from here. What would they find there? What secret had been worth 3 years of Axel's torture? The dog lay with his head in James's lap, finally allowing himself to rest. Looking down at his old friend, James felt a fierce surge of protective love. Whatever they were caught up in, whatever truth Mike had died trying to expose, he would see it through. For Axel, for Mike, for justice. The truck hit a pothole, jolting them. Axel whimpered softly, and James noticed fresh blood on the blanket. His partner needed medical attention soon, but regular vets would ask too many questions, might even report them to authorities who could be compromised. Then he remembered someone, Dr. Sarah Chen, a vet who had treated military dogs during his deployment. She had left the service to open a private practice in a small town not far from here. If anyone would help them without asking too many questions, it would be her. James leaned forward and tapped on the truck's back window. The ranger slid it open. "There's a town called Millbrook, about 30 miles east," James said.
"Know it," the ranger nodded. "Sure, pass through there sometimes. That way you're headed?"
"Yeah, I have a friend there who can help." As the ranger turned onto a larger road, James felt Axel relax slightly. Perhaps the dog remembered Dr. Chen too, or maybe he simply sensed they were heading towards help rather than running from danger. But James couldn't shake the feeling that this was just a brief respite. Somewhere behind them, 2 groups of professional operators were engaged in a firefight. Someone had spent 3 years torturing Axel for information, and somewhere in the mountains a set of coordinates held answers that powerful people would kill to protect. Their journey was far from over. The ride to Millbrook took nearly 2 hours, each bump in the road drawing a quiet whimper from Axel. James kept one hand on his partner's head, offering what comfort he could while watching the darkness for signs of pursuit. The ranger, who introduced himself as Kevin, seemed content with silence, occasionally glancing at them in his rearview mirror. Dawn was breaking when they reached the outskirts of Millbrook, the sky turning a pale grey above the sleepy town. Kevin pulled into a gas station, the fluorescent lights harsh after hours of darkness. "This is as far as I go," he said, turning around in his seat. "You sure you don't want me to call someone?" James shook his head, helping Axel down from the truck bed. "Thanks for the ride. We'll be fine from here." As Kevin's truck disappeared into the morning mist, James took stock of their situation. His shoulder had stopped bleeding but throbbed with every movement. Axel was barely standing, his legs trembling with exhaustion. They needed to find Dr. Chen quickly. James remembered her clinic being on the east side of town, near the old railroad tracks. Supporting some of Axel's weight, they made their way through empty streets, avoiding the few early morning workers starting their days. The clinic was a small building with peeling blue paint and a simple sign, Chen Veterinary Services. The lights were off, but a car was parked around back, an early arrival. James led Axel to the rear entrance and knocked softly. After a moment, footsteps approached. The door opened a crack, and a familiar face peered out. Dr. Sarah Chen, looking exactly as James remembered her. Her dark hair was streaked with more grey now, but her eyes were still sharp and observant behind her glasses. Those eyes widened as she took in the sight before her. "Sergeant Carter, but you—" Her gaze fell to Axel, and she gasped. "Oh my God, is that—" "We need help, Sarah," James said quietly, "and we need it off the books." She hesitated only a second before opening the door wider. "Get in quickly." The back room of the clinic was warm and smelled of antiseptic. Dr. Chen helped James lift Axel onto an examination table, her experienced hands already checking vital signs. "This dog was declared KIA 3 years ago," she said as she worked. "I signed the death certificate myself." "It's a long story," James replied, "and not a safe one to know." She met his eyes. "Does this have anything to do with the rumors?" "What rumors?" Dr. Chen's hands never stopped moving as she spoke, cleaning Axel's wounds with practiced efficiency. After the ambush, there were whispers in the military veterinary community. Some of our best canines were being lost in suspicious circumstances. Training accidents, ambushes, disappearances. Always the most highly trained dogs, ones with special operations experience. James felt a chill run down his spine. "How many?" "At least 7 that I know of, all declared killed in action, all bodies never recovered." She gestured to Axel's scars. "These aren't random abuse marks, they're systematic. Someone was trying to condition him, to break him down and rebuild him. But why? What could they want from a dog?" Dr. Chen's expression was grim. "You'd be amazed what these dogs know, Sergeant. They see everything, remember everything, routes, faces, locations. And they can't be interrogated in traditional ways, can't be broken by normal psychological pressure. So someone developed other methods." As if understanding they were talking about him, Axel whined softly. James stroked his head, noticing how the dog leaned into his touch now, trusting him again despite years of abuse. "He recognized coordinates," James said quietly. "In the ranger station. He showed them to me." Dr. Chen paused in her work. "That doesn't surprise me. These dogs are trained to remember specific locations, to lead their handlers back to places of interest. Whatever Axel saw 3 years ago, whatever he knows—" She trailed off as a sound caught her attention. "Did you hear that?" James tensed, listening. Footsteps in the front of the clinic, the scrape of a lock being picked. "Is there another way out?" he whispered. Dr. Chen nodded towards a small window. "But Axel's in no condition to run. He needs at least an hour for the medications to start working." The footsteps were getting closer. James made a quick decision. "Hide him. I'll lead them away." "James, no. Sarah, please. Whatever's going on, it's bigger than us. Axel's the key to everything. Promise me you'll protect him." After a moment, she nodded. "There's a concealed storage space under the operating room floor. We used to hide rescued fighting dogs there during raids." Together, they quickly moved Axel to the hidden space. The dog tried to resist, not wanting to leave James, but was too weak to fight. "I'll come back for you," James promised, looking into his partner's eyes. "Just like you waited for me. Trust me, buddy." The hidden door closed just as the examining room door began to open. James slipped out the window, deliberately leaving a blood smear on the sill. As he ran down the alley, he heard shouts behind him. They took the bait. His shoulder screamed in protest as he vaulted a fence, but he pushed through the pain. He had to put as much distance between them and the clinic as possible, had to make them believe Axel was with him. A bullet sparked off the wall beside his head. They weren't trying to be quiet anymore. James ducked into a narrow space between buildings, his mind racing. He couldn't keep running forever. He needed a plan. Then he saw it, the railroad tracks, and beyond them the old grain mill, its abandoned bulk rising against the morning sky like a fortress. If he could reach it, he might have a chance to turn the table on his pursuers. More bullets kicked up dust at his feet as he sprinted across the open ground towards the mill. His lungs were burning, his wounded shoulder sending waves of fire down his arm, but he kept running, driven by a single thought. Every step took their hunters further from Axel. He just hoped his partner would understand why he had to leave him behind, and that whatever secret was hidden in those coordinates was worth all this pain. The interior of the grain mill was a maze of rusted machinery and shadows. James's boots kicked up clouds of ancient dust as he ran, leaving obvious tracks, but that was part of the plan. He needed his pursuers to follow him deep into the building. Years of military training kicked in as he moved. Every shadow could be a hiding place, every rusted piece of equipment a potential weapon. He could hear them entering the building below, their footsteps echoing on metal stairs. "Split up," a voice commanded. "Watch the exits. He's trapped in here." James allowed himself a grim smile. That's what they thought. He hadn't spent 3 years training in urban warfare for nothing. This wasn't his trap, it was theirs. Meanwhile, back at the clinic, Dr. Chen worked quickly to treat Axel's wounds. The hidden space under the floor was cramped but secure, lined with old blankets that helped muffle any sounds. She could feel the dog's eyes on her as she cleaned his injuries, intelligent and worried. "He'll come back," she whispered, more to herself than to Axel. He always completed his missions no matter what. This time won't be different. Back in the mill, James had reached the upper level. Ancient grain hoppers hung from the ceiling like giant metal cocoons, their sides stained with rust. The morning light filtered through broken windows, creating patches of shadow and light. He heard footsteps on the catwalk below him, 2 men moving carefully, weapons ready. They were professionals, checking corners, maintaining spacing, but they had one disadvantage. They didn't know the truth about that day, 3 years ago, not like he was starting to figure it out. The pieces were falling into place now. The suspicious deaths of other military dogs, the coordinated ambush, the years spent torturing Axel for information. This wasn't about military secrets or strategic locations. This was about something specific that Axel had seen, something so important that powerful people had spent years trying to extract it from his loyal mind. A floorboard creaked behind him. James spun, but he was a fraction too slow. A fist caught him in the wounded shoulder, sending explosions of pain through his body. He staggered back, barely blocking a second strike. His attacker was dressed in black tactical gear, face hidden behind a mask. They fought in silence, each blow calculated and precise. This wasn't a street brawl, this was military combat training. James managed to land a solid hit to his attacker's solar plexus, buying himself a moment to reach for a rusted pipe lying nearby. But as he grabbed it, something about the man's fighting style clicked in his mind. The way he moved, the combination of strikes.
"Morrison," James gasped. "Jack Morrison!"
The man hesitated for just a fraction of a second, but it was enough to confirm James's suspicion. Morrison had been their hand-to-hand combat instructor, one of the best in the special operations community. He had also been there the day of the ambush. "Why?" James demanded, keeping the pipe ready. "Why are you involved in this?" Morrison's response was another attack, but James was ready this time. He blocked the strikes, turning his opponent's momentum against him. They crashed into an old control panel, sending sparks flying from ancient electrical connections. "Was it all a lie?" James pressed. "The training, the brotherhood, did you help set up the ambush?"
"You don't understand," Morrison growled, his voice muffled by the mask. "What that dog saw, it could bring down entire operations. People would die. People already died."
James shot back. "Mike died, and you tortured Axel for 3 years. Their fight had attracted attention. James could hear the others running up the stairs. He needed to end this now. "Whatever Axel saw," James said, "whatever's at those coordinates, Mike thought people needed to know. That's why he left the message. That's why you couldn't break Axel. Some things are worth dying for." Morrison lunged forward, but his attack was rushed, emotional. James sidestepped, swinging the pipe with all his strength. It connected with Morrison's temple, dropping him to the floor. The others were almost there. James ran to one of the broken windows, looking down at the railroad tracks below. A crazy idea formed in his mind. Back at the clinic, Axel suddenly lifted his head, ears perking up. Dr. Chen paused in her work, listening. In the distance, she could hear the whistle of the morning freight train approaching the crossing. James took a deep breath, looking at the approaching train. The timing would have to be perfect. He could hear his pursuers reaching the upper level, shouting as they found Morrison unconscious. "Follow the coordinates, Axel," he whispered. Then he jumped. For a moment he was falling through empty air, the ground rushing up to meet him. Then he hit the roof of a passing freight car, rolling with the impact. Pain exploded through his wounded shoulder, but he held on as the train picked up speed, carrying him away from the mill, from Morrison, from the truth he was starting to uncover. His last glimpse of Millbrook was the old grain mill silhouetted against the rising sun, his pursuers watching helplessly from the broken window. They wouldn't follow. The train was moving too fast now, heading west into the mountains.
But James wasn't running away.